How does someone bridge two completely different civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of different thinking? What kind of genius can master Chinese language, philosophy, and culture while introducing revolutionary ideas that would transform the Middle Kingdom forever? Why did the Jesuit who entered China as a foreign barbarian become honored as one of history's greatest cultural ambassadors? And what makes someone ready to become a bridge between worlds? This is the story of Saint Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit who entered the Forbidden Kingdom. If you've ever faced the challenge of communicating across cultural barriers or wondered whether faith can transcend any boundary, this story will show you that love and intelligence combined can open doors that seem permanently sealed. Hit like and subscribe for more stories that show how ideas, not armies, reshaped empires. In the vibrant city of Macerata, nestled in the rolling hills of central Italy, a boy was born in 1552 who would one day become the bridge between East and West. The man who would introduce Christianity to the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. Matteo Ricci entered a world where the Renaissance was reaching its peak, where art and science were flourishing, and where ambitious young men could dream of reshaping the world through knowledge and exploration. Picture the Ricci family palazzo, its walls lined with maps showing the expanding boundaries of the known world. Where young Matteo grew up hearing stories of Portuguese navigators discovering sea routes to the Indies and Spanish conquistadors claiming vast territories in the New World. His father, Giovanni Battista Ricci, was a successful pharmacist and minor nobleman who ensured his son received the finest education available. From his earliest years, Matteo displayed an extraordinary intellectual gift that amazed his tutors. He mastered Latin and Greek with startling speed, devoured classical literature, and showed particular brilliance in mathematics and the emerging sciences that were revolutionizing European understanding of the natural world. But what set Matteo apart was not just his intelligence, but his insatiable curiosity about how other people thought and lived. While his classmates were content to study European authors, Matteo peppered his teachers with questions about the customs, languages, and philosophies of distant lands. At 16, Matteo was sent to Rome to study at the Roman College, the prestigious Jesuit university that attracted the brightest minds from across Europe. The Jesuits, founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola just a few decades earlier, had already gained a reputation for combining rigorous intellectual training with missionary zeal. Picture the halls of the Roman College, where young Matteo encountered not just European learning, but also reports from Jesuit missionaries working in India, Japan, and the edges of the vast Chinese Empire. These accounts of ancient civilizations with sophisticated philosophies and technologies that rivaled anything in Europe captured his imagination completely. Under the guidance of Jesuit professors, Matteo's academic brilliance was matched by growing spiritual depth. He was particularly influenced by Christopher Clavius, the great mathematician and astronomer who would later reform the calendar for Pope Gregory XIII. Clavius taught Matteo that faith and reason were not enemies, but partners in the search for truth. What drives someone to dedicate their life to understanding people completely different from themselves? In 1571, at age 19, Matteo shocked his family by announcing his intention to join the Society of Jesus. His father had planned a brilliant career for him in law or medicine, paths that would bring honor and wealth to the Ricci name. Instead, Matteo chose poverty, obedience, and the possibility of exile to distant lands where he might never be heard from again. But Matteo had caught a vision that would shape his entire life. The possibility of bringing the gospel to civilizations that had never heard the name of Christ, not through conquest or coercion, but through the patient work of understanding, respect, and intellectual dialogue. His greatest adventure was about to begin. After completing his Jesuit formation, Matteo volunteered for the missions to the Far East, a decision that meant saying goodbye to family, friends, and homeland forever. In 1578, he sailed from Lisbon on a Portuguese merchant vessel, beginning a journey that would take him halfway around the world to lands that most Europeans considered mythical. Picture the months-long voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Indian Ocean's monsoon winds, as Matteo used every day to prepare for his mission by studying what little information existed about Chinese culture, language, and religion. The journey itself was an education in the vastness and diversity of the world beyond Europe. Matteo's first stop was Goa, the Portuguese colony in India that served as the headquarters for Jesuit missions throughout Asia. Here he encountered his first glimpse of the complexity of Asian civilizations. Hindu temples with elaborate philosophies, Muslim scholars with sophisticated mathematics, and traders who spoke of the great empire of China, where learning and culture had flourished for thousands of years. But it was in Macau, the tiny Portuguese trading post on the edge of the Chinese empire, that Matteo began to understand the true magnitude of his calling. China was not just another country to be evangelized. It was a civilization more ancient than Rome, with a written history spanning millennia, philosophical traditions of extraordinary depth, and technologies that surpassed anything in Europe. The challenge was overwhelming. Chinese authorities allowed very few foreigners beyond Macau, and those who were permitted to enter were treated as tribute-bearing barbarians from inferior civilizations. No European had ever gained access to the imperial court or been accepted as an equal by Chinese scholars. Previous missionary attempts had failed completely. Chinese officials viewed Christianity as a foreign superstition that threatened social order. Christian preaching about the equality of all souls before God struck at the foundation of Chinese society, which was built on elaborate hierarchies of respect and obligation. Matteo made a decision that would revolutionize Christian missions in Asia. Instead of approaching China as a conqueror or even as a foreign teacher, he would become Chinese himself, mastering their language perfectly, understanding their philosophy deeply, and earning acceptance as a scholar in their own intellectual tradition. Have you ever tried to understand someone so different that it required becoming a different person yourself? For 3 years in Macau, Matteo threw himself into Chinese studies with the same intensity he had once brought to Latin and mathematics. He learned to read and write thousands of Chinese characters, studied the classical texts that formed the foundation of Chinese education, and began to understand the sophisticated worldview that had shaped Chinese civilization for centuries. What he discovered was both inspiring and challenging. Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism, emphasized many values that aligned perfectly with Christian teaching. The importance of virtue, the obligation to care for others, the pursuit of wisdom and self-improvement. But it also contained elements that seemed incompatible with Christianity. Ancestor veneration, the divine mandate of emperors, and the exclusion of any ultimate reality beyond the natural world. The breakthrough came when Matteo realized that his mission was not to destroy Chinese culture, but to complete it, to show how the deepest insights of Chinese philosophy pointed toward truths that Christianity could fulfill. In 1583, Matteo finally received permission to enter China proper, establishing himself in the city of Zhaoqing as the first European to live permanently in the Chinese interior. But his strategy for gaining acceptance was unprecedented in missionary history. Instead of emphasizing his foreign origins, he would become as Chinese as possible while remaining utterly Catholic. Picture Matteo adopting Chinese dress, Chinese customs, and Chinese ways of thinking, while carefully studying how to present Christian truths in language and concepts that Chinese scholars could understand. He even took a Chinese name, Li Madu. With his new name, he then began presenting himself not as a foreign missionary, but as a Western scholar who had come to learn from Chinese wisdom while sharing insights from his own tradition. The transformation was remarkable. Matteo learned to bow correctly to superiors, to navigate the complex rules of Chinese etiquette, and to participate in scholarly discussions about Confucian ethics and Neo-Confucian metaphysics. He studied Chinese poetry, practiced Chinese calligraphy, and mastered the subtle art of indirect communication that characterized Chinese intellectual discourse. But Matteo's masterstroke was his approach to Chinese religion and philosophy. Instead of attacking Confucianism as pagan error, he argued that Confucius had been a great teacher whose insights about ethics and social order prepared the way for Christian revelation. He claimed that the ancient Chinese had originally worshipped the true God under different names, and that Christianity was not a foreign religion, but the restoration of China's oldest and purest religious tradition. This approach was revolutionary and controversial. Other missionaries accused Matteo of compromising Christian truth by accommodating pagan customs. Chinese scholars were initially suspicious of claims that their ancient traditions pointed toward a foreign religion. But gradually, Matteo's strategy began to work. Chinese intellectuals were impressed by his genuine respect for their culture and his sophisticated understanding of their philosophical traditions. Instead of the typical foreign barbarian who dismissed Chinese learning as ignorant superstition, here was a Westerner who could engage Confucian scholars as an intellectual equal. What would it take to master a completely foreign way of thinking while maintaining your deepest convictions? The breakthrough came when Matteo began demonstrating Western scientific knowledge that complemented rather than contradicted Chinese learning. He introduced new mathematical techniques, improved methods of cartography, and mechanical clocks that amazed Chinese scholars with their precision. Most importantly, Matteo created the first accurate world map in Chinese, showing China's place in a much larger world than Chinese geography had imagined. But he positioned China at the center of the map, honoring Chinese assumptions about their central place in civilization while gently expanding their understanding of the world's scope. This combination of respect for Chinese culture and demonstration of valuable new knowledge opened doors that had been sealed to all previous foreigners. Chinese officials began inviting Matteo to their homes. Scholars sought his opinions on philosophical questions. Word began to spread that an extraordinary Western teacher had arrived who could contribute to Chinese learning rather than merely challenging it. But Matteo's greatest test was yet to come. The challenge of reaching the imperial court itself, the heart of the Forbidden Kingdom, where no foreigner had ever been accepted as anything more than a curious barbarian. As Matteo's reputation grew throughout southern China, he set his sights on the ultimate goal: Beijing, the imperial capital where the emperor ruled over the most populous nation on earth from behind the walls of the Forbidden City. For any foreigner, and especially for a Christian missionary, reaching Beijing seemed impossible. Picture the Chinese imperial system, with its elaborate bureaucracy of scholar officials who viewed themselves as guardians of a civilization infinitely superior to anything the barbarian world could offer. These mandarins had spent their lives mastering classical Chinese texts and competing in examinations that tested their knowledge of literature, philosophy, and statecraft. Matteo's strategy for reaching Beijing was characteristically indirect and patient. Instead of seeking audience with the emperor immediately, he would win the respect of influential officials one by one, gradually building a network of supporters who could facilitate his journey to the capital. The process took years. Matteo moved slowly northward, establishing residences in Nanchang and Nanjing, always presenting himself as a scholar rather than a missionary, always emphasizing what he could contribute to Chinese learning rather than what he hoped to change about Chinese religion. His breakthrough came through his mastery of memory techniques and mathematical knowledge that impressed Chinese intellectuals. Matteo introduced Western mnemonic systems that helped Chinese students memorize vast amounts of classical literature more efficiently. He demonstrated geometric principles that had practical applications in engineering and architecture. But perhaps most importantly, Matteo became fluent in the subtle art of Chinese friendship. He understood that in Chinese culture, relationships were built slowly through the exchange of favors, the demonstration of loyalty, and the patient cultivation of mutual respect. Chinese scholars began recommending Matteo to their colleagues as an extraordinary foreign teacher whose knowledge complemented their own learning. Officials who had initially viewed him with suspicion came to value his insights and seek his advice on practical problems. Have you ever earned acceptance in a community that initially saw you as an outsider? The invitation to Beijing finally came in 1598, when influential court officials requested Matteo's presence to help with calendar reform and other technical projects that required mathematical expertise. But even this invitation came with conditions. Matteo would be received as a tribute-bearing representative of the Western kingdoms, acknowledging China's superiority and the emperor's supreme authority. For many missionaries, accepting such conditions would have been unthinkable. It seemed to compromise the Christian message about the equality of all people before God and the ultimate authority of Christ over all earthly rulers. But Matteo understood that gaining access to Chinese culture required working within Chinese assumptions, at least initially. His journey to Beijing was a triumph of cultural adaptation and patient diplomacy. The foreign priest who had once been viewed as a barbarian was now traveling to the imperial capital as an honored scholar whose presence was specifically requested by the court. But his greatest challenges still lay ahead in the heart of the Forbidden Kingdom. When Matteo finally reached Beijing in 1601, he achieved something unprecedented in the history of East-West relations. He became the first European to be received not as a tribute-bearing barbarian, but as a respected scholar whose knowledge was valued by the imperial court itself. Picture the moment when Matteo first entered the Forbidden City, its red walls and golden roofs rising majestically from the heart of Beijing, as he carried gifts carefully chosen to demonstrate Western learning. Mechanical clocks, mathematical instruments, and maps showing the broader world beyond China's borders. The emperor, Wan Li, was intrigued by these foreign innovations, but even more impressed by reports of Matteo's scholarly abilities and his respectful approach to Chinese culture. Unlike previous foreigners who had demanded audience rights or dismissed Chinese customs as inferior, this Western scholar seemed to understand that true learning required humility and patience. Matteo's strategy in the imperial court was masterful. He never directly challenged Chinese assumptions about their cultural superiority, but gradually introduced ideas that expanded Chinese understanding of the world and their place in it. His world map showed China as a great civilization among other great civilizations, rather than the only center of human culture. His mechanical clocks demonstrated Western technological innovations, while respecting Chinese appreciation for precision and craftsmanship. His mathematical knowledge complemented Chinese scholarly traditions rather than replacing them. But most importantly, Matteo began introducing Christian concepts through Chinese philosophical categories. He argued that the Christian God was the same ultimate reality that ancient Chinese texts called heaven or Lord on high. He claimed that Christian ethics fulfilled the moral aspirations that Confucian philosophy had always promoted. This approach scandalized other missionaries who accused Matteo of compromising essential Christian truths. How could he claim that Chinese ancestor veneration was compatible with Christian teaching? How could he suggest that Confucian philosophy prepared the way for Christian revelation? But Matteo's method was producing unprecedented results. Chinese scholars began converting to Christianity not because they were rejecting their cultural heritage, but because they believed Christianity completed and fulfilled their philosophical quest for truth. What would you risk to build bridges between two worlds that seemed completely incompatible? The most dramatic example was Xu Guangqi, one of China's most brilliant scholars and a close friend of Matteo's, who became a Christian while continuing to serve in high government positions and contributing to both Chinese scholarship and Christian understanding. Through Xu Guangqi and other converts, Matteo gained access to the highest levels of Chinese intellectual life. He collaborated with Chinese scholars on translations of classical Western texts into Chinese and Chinese philosophical works into Latin, creating the first genuine intellectual exchange between East and West. But Matteo's most important achievement was subtler. He had demonstrated that Christianity could take root in any culture without destroying what was good and true in that culture's heritage. During his years in Beijing, Matteo accomplished something that seemed impossible. He became simultaneously a respected Confucian scholar and a faithful Catholic priest, a bridge between civilizations that had never understood each other. His residence became a meeting place where Chinese intellectuals and Western learning encountered each other as equals for the first time in history. Picture Matteo's study in Beijing, where Chinese scholars worked alongside European texts, where Confucian classics sat next to Catholic theology, where East and West engaged in genuine dialogue rather than mutual incomprehension or hostility. Matteo's greatest literary achievement was The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, a book that presented Christian doctrine entirely through Chinese philosophical concepts and references to Chinese writings. Instead of quoting European theologians, Matteo demonstrated that Chinese sages had always been seeking the same truths that Christianity revealed more completely. The book was revolutionary in both directions. For Chinese readers, it showed how Christian revelation could complete their philosophical quest without destroying their cultural identity. For European readers, it demonstrated that the gospel could be translated into any cultural context while maintaining its essential truth. But Matteo's influence extended far beyond religious conversion. He introduced Western mathematics, astronomy, and cartography to China while transmitting Chinese philosophy, literature, and scientific discoveries to Europe. His letters and reports gave Europeans their first accurate understanding of Chinese civilization, correcting centuries of myth and misunderstanding. Through Matteo's work, Chinese scholars learned about Euclidean geometry, the Gregorian calendar, and mechanical engineering. European intellectuals discovered Chinese innovations in printing, gunpowder, and navigation that had preceded similar European developments by centuries. This intellectual exchange transformed both civilizations. Chinese cartography improved dramatically through Western mathematical techniques. European philosophy was enriched by encounter with Confucian ethics and Neo-Confucian metaphysics. Have you ever seen two different worlds transform each other through genuine understanding? But perhaps Matteo's most important contribution was methodological. He had demonstrated that effective missionary work required not just proclamation, but also enculturation, not just teaching, but also learning, not just conversion, but also translation between different ways of understanding reality. His approach would influence Catholic missions worldwide, establishing the principle that the gospel could be authentically proclaimed in any cultural context without destroying what was good and true in that culture's heritage. As Matteo aged, he knew his time in China was limited, but he had laid foundations that would endure. A Chinese Christian community that was authentically both Chinese and Christian, intellectual exchanges between East and West that would continue for centuries, and a model for cross-cultural dialogue that remains relevant today. On the 11th of May 1610, Matteo Ricci died in Beijing at age 57, having spent 27 years of his life in China, longer than many Chinese had lived. His death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a legacy that would transform both East and West for centuries to come. Picture the unprecedented honor accorded to Matteo's funeral in Beijing, where Chinese officials and scholars joined with the Christian community he had founded to mourn a man who had become both Chinese and Christian, both Eastern and Western, both scholar and saint. The emperor himself granted permission for Matteo to be buried in Beijing, an honor never before accorded to any foreigner. The grave site became a symbol of the possibility for genuine dialogue between civilizations, a place where East and West could meet not as conqueror and conquered, but as partners in the search for truth. Matteo's Chinese Christian community continued to flourish after his death, producing scholars, officials, and artists who remained both faithful Catholics and proud Chinese. They had proven that conversion to Christianity did not require cultural suicide, that faith could be authentically expressed in any cultural context. The intellectual exchange that Matteo initiated continued for centuries. Chinese mathematical and scientific innovations influenced European development during the Scientific Revolution. European missionary scholars continued translating classical Chinese texts that influenced Enlightenment philosophy and political theory. Voltaire, Leibniz, and other European thinkers drew extensively on Matteo's reports about Chinese philosophy and governance. The Chinese examination system influenced European civil service reform. Confucian ethics provided alternatives to purely Western approaches to moral philosophy. But Matteo's most important legacy was methodological. He had demonstrated that effective evangelization required what would later be called enculturation, the patient work of understanding local culture so thoroughly that the gospel could be proclaimed in indigenous terms without losing its essential meaning. This approach would influence Catholic missions worldwide. Instead of simply imposing European forms of Christianity, missionaries began studying local languages, customs, and philosophies to find authentic ways of expressing Christian truth in every cultural context. Modern Catholic teaching on enculturation draws heavily on Matteo's example. The Second Vatican Council's emphasis on dialogue with other cultures and religions reflects principles that Matteo pioneered in 17th century China. Today, Saint Matteo Ricci is honored as a patron of East-West dialogue and cross-cultural understanding. His feast day is celebrated by Catholics worldwide as a reminder that the gospel can take root in any soil without destroying what is good and true in local traditions. The Jesuit who entered the Forbidden Kingdom proved that no culture is too alien for Christian truth, no civilization too ancient for evangelical renewal, and no barrier too high for love and intelligence working together. From the hills of Macerata to the forbidden city of Beijing, from Renaissance Italy to imperial China, Matteo showed that the greatest missionaries are those who become bridges between worlds, translating not just languages, but entire ways of understanding reality. He demonstrated that faith and culture can enrich each other, that Christianity can become authentically Chinese or Indian or African without ceasing to be Christian, and that the gospel's truth is large enough to embrace every human way of seeking meaning and purpose. The scholar who became Chinese while remaining Catholic continues to inspire anyone who faces the challenge of communicating across cultural barriers, reminding us that understanding always comes before conversion, that respect precedes revelation, and that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the patient work of building bridges between hearts and minds.